Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ancient Warfare Podcast. My name is Jasper Orthuis. I'm the editor of Ancient Warfare magazine, and with me today are Mark DeSantis, Murray Dom, the assistant editor, Mark McCaffrey, and Lindsay Powell. And because it's for me at least, it's 11:30 on a Friday night in July. So what better to do than talk about a movie, or actually not even a movie yet, a trailer. We just thought we'd have a really good rant about the trailer for Gladiator II, and you might say everyone's been doing that, but we could say that Gladiator One, or Gladiator, as it's better known, had something to do, perhaps, with the origins of the magazine, because at the time, Roman Army Talk, the forum that this magazine more or less originated in, had just started on, gosh, easy boards or something like that, for anybody who was around that long ago. And the fact that Gladiator came out certainly boosted the interest in ancient warfare and ancient history in general. I think that many of us who are professionally in this sort of area of history can thank the movie for that. But there were one or two niggles with that movie. In fact, there are whole threads on Roman Army Talk that you could probably still find about everything that was not right about the equipment, the tactics, and perhaps the broader history. And now there's a 3-minute trailer out, and we can talk about some of the things we spotted in there that we may or may not have issues with. Who would like to start with the title card?
I'll just throw something in because it was a comment that somebody made on Facebook. Where this thing has a whole life all of its own is the flooded arena of the Colosseum, which apparently seems to be like 30 feet deep or something, and crocodiles and sharks and all sorts of stuff. The point I made was that the film is supposed to be set in, is it 317 or 217?
217,
Something like that. 217. Right. Well, it would be impossible to actually do a naumachia, a sea battle in the Colosseum, because it was built in AD 80, finished in AD 80. And then around about AD 90, Domitian actually put in the Hypogeum. So you couldn't actually flood it at this point because it was basically now machinery and all sorts of structures. So by definition, for about 100 and something years, 110 years or whatever it is, it had been converted into a style of building that could not be flooded anymore. So that's my piece.
I would say that I've actually read some material recently on that one, arguing against that and saying actually there's a line of argument saying, yes, it could have been flooded, but there's only one little problem with that, and that would be that with the amount of water that you need to, they show it sort of flooding in to get about, I believe about 1.5 meters of water filling the basement. It would take something between 2 and 5 hours. It would then also be, as you've just said, that excavation down means that 1.5 meters of water is actually going to be way down in the basement. So actually the crowd are going to be really struggling to actually see what's happening in that basement. Never mind. So yes, there is that argument that could be done, but to what ends? Not much. So yes, as you've say, there's some argument for maybe the Colosseum being used for naumachia back when it was first being built, but again, where did the water come from? It's going to have to come from an aqueduct. You'd have to divert one of the aqueducts, probably the Aqua Claudia. And again, that comes in a whole problem.
Don't forget, so that area, from what I understand, was originally a sort of lake that was part of the Domus Aurea. And it was swampy ground. And in fact, what they had to do was drain it anyway in order to build the Colosseum. So it was always something that had hydraulics associated with it. I assume that at a certain point, it no longer produced that water. And yes, you're right, they would need to probably pump water in through an aqueduct. But it just doesn't make sense because there was already an naumachia which Augustus had built in another part of the city, which was purposely built for that thing.
Well, there was already two, actually. It wasn't just Augustus. Caesar had already built a temporary one over on the Campus Martius at one point. That eventually got filled in before probably by the time Augustus is actually building his across the Tiber. Later on, Trajan builds one. There's supposedly one in between that, but that most people sort of
Claudius
think
did a really
maybe,
big one, yeah.
yeah. But again, that's probably when they say Trajan built one, he probably just renovated one so that in the end there's only two on the mapping. So, but again, they are linked very closely to both the Tiber and also another one of the aqueducts that comes in from the, what's that, from the northwest, if I believe. But again, it's a far cry from the Colosseum.
You're letting history get in the way of a good,
No,
entertaining,
but let's
cool,
finish,
rule of
Murray.
cool.
The Namakya, I mean, there were Namakya. I think there are testimonies for Namakya of some kind in the Colosseum. But of course, you don't have very much space. The areas for the Namakya that Mark just mentioned are much bigger, even though there you will hardly be able to maneuver with any actual ships.
Well, I've got the Augustan one is 1,800 feet by 1,200 feet, but that's sort of the one in the city. Of course, they also use the Fucine Lake to the east of Rome, and of course for that's a massive area. If you have a look at it, go and have a look at it on Google Earth, and again, that gives room for maneuver of ships and actually getting up speed. So,
But in the Colosseum, you have what, like 90 by 50 meters, something like that. And that probably means that it was, props, maybe just a tiny layer of water and sort of got it, the whole point is not so much it's just a stage show and it's a group fight. And as those ships are real, meh.
but then to confuse that, there has been some argument that there are some drains in the Colosseum for letting out water, which don't serve any other purpose.
No, but if you have to have some water, but even 70 or 90 by 50 meters, if you have a foot of water, is still a lot of water.
But once you put that machinery in and the lifts, I think that aren't there 3 floors technically within the lower elevations? So you're not going to rip all that out at great expense. But
No,
I think
but there are no testimonials, I think, for Namakya in the Colosseum after the Flavians, except some really late Roman references to that they're still doing them.
So the ironical thing is that Sir Ridley's screenplay writer was onto something with sea battles as a form of entertainment. So that's check. Yes, it's historically correct. But by putting it in the Colosseum, not only committed a historical faux pas, but actually limited himself in terms of what he could have done with it. Because if he'd actually done what Mark has just said there with this huge, big purpose-built Nemanja, it could have been a bloody fantastic thing rather than this contrived nonsense.
Yeah, but I think the issue with that is like most historical films, in order to show that in the entertaining way that we would like, you would need a documentary first on explaining Naumachia, explaining where they happened, explaining that's why we're not in the place, the Colosseum, and the idea that there are amphitheaters
but all that
everywhere.
takes is like a panning in shot of like across the city to the Naumachia, wouldn't it?
No, because you get people saying, why isn't it there? Why isn't it there? I mean, it's why Alexander didn't work. It's why every historical film gets its thing wrong and fixates on the thing people know. It's why all Romans wear lorica segmentata at all phases of Roman history. And that's what people know.
We should preface this. If you go to the site of Ancient Warfare magazine, ancientwarfare.com, and you just go to the search and you type in bingo, the first hit you get is Murray's Ancient Warfare bingo card. That will be fun to watch any ancient movie with, but especially when Gladiator II comes out, print it out and take it with you to the cinema. And when you have a full card, shout bingo really loudly.
I think we have to have a disclaimer that we bear no responsibility as to how drunk you will get doing the bingo card drinking game. So anyway, actually just play the bingo card. Don't do the drinking game because you won't see the rest of the movie. You'll be asleep. All right, we haven't got past the first 6 seconds.
I see that we were asked a question about special effects, and I'm a fan of practical effects. That is, using actually something that's there, maybe with the addition of computer effects, computer-aided effects. But I think that the mind still sees what is real, and that it actually adds to the viewing pleasure, the reality of whatever it is, as opposed to it being purely something that's created on a computer.
it also hasn't gotten any much cheaper. It's still incredibly expensive with the advance in technology. So actually to do high quality CGI for large portions of the film is incredibly expensive.
And the shame is, to that point, that there's history in 3D, there's Flyover Rome, there's a couple of other ones, like Darius Arias got one. That there are now a couple, three, four really good quality reconstructions of Rome, admittedly in the 4th century, but there are adaptations you can do that these people could have licensed. And they've got something that really looks great. I mean, if you see Daniel Loginov History in 3D models, I mean, they're blow mind good. And these things can be adapted, and you get a much better product. And everybody here would be slapping each other's shoulders in joy at how wonderful it looked. But they don't want to do that.
The problem with that is licensing and paying money and permissions. And, you give us your product for free. I won't do that. Well, pay me this. Well, we won't do that. That's why they don't, it's very great pity.
It's interesting that the general idea, though, that they're clearly at the moment we've got potentially 3 Gladiator related things which people can watch. You can watch Those About to Die right now on Amazon / Peacock. You can wait to see in November Gladiator 2 and Spartacus, which is part of the big franchise there. I think it's House of Ashur or something, is in the pipeline as well. So this is like the arrival of 3 buses all at the same time, right?
So we're going to get a lot of interest in Assyrian stuff too, the House of Ashur.
It's Spartacus. So clearly Hollywood has decided that there's money to be made in Gladiators, which is
in the remakes.
Well, in the remakes, but to your point earlier, which is that this was good for ancient warfare because it sparked people's interest in ancient history. And our mission then is to bring people onto the straight and narrow and say, well, actually, it was much better than you saw in the film. But here's the reason why. The armor is really cool and stuff. And I think that's good. We should look forward to a burgeoning of interest again in ancient warfare. So I'm going to try and be positive about this.
Sure, we could always try and exploit it, like everybody should.
What is it about gladiators, though? Why are the gladiators themselves is it just the pure combat of one-on-one action that because clearly if you have 3 different shows coming out or movies, series at the same time, there must be something about a gladiator, as a gladiator that is built-in drama, I guess, a fight scene every episode.
It seems like a Gladiator sort of, certainly the version that we saw in Gladiator, in the first Gladiator, and perhaps in this one too, sort of fits in the superhero vein. Oh, it's one guy who fights himself to the pinnacle.
The wronged man against the tyrannical, corrupt political system. And you're seeing that again in all the state. And even the Spartacus versions that Stars put out and others put out, that's the same story. That Rome is corrupt, and this is a good individual who's opposing that corrupt system, who's going to repair it.
But in Gladiator, this run, isn't it something also the backstory of Macrinus, which is Denzel Washington? I mean, there really was a Roman Emperor Macrinus, right? And they made him out to be a black man.
Well, a year.
Okay.
I wonder if they will put Caracalla's death in this movie and how Macrinus got to power. Caracalla just going to do his ablutions, and then somebody goes, "Hey, you need company?"
Oh, what's his name? Oh, it's the wrestler. Oh, not a superstar of wrestling, but a wrestler. And the funny thing about that, sorry to get distracted, is that he's one of the advisors of Lucius Verus on the Parthian War, that wrestler. And he's the only one who doesn't get dismissed when Lucius Verus dies. And so he's the one who comes back to...
Is this the wrestler from Commodus's death?
Oh, yes. Am I jumping? I'm jumping. Commodus's death. Wrong. That's the first movie, not the second movie.
Yeah, but in the first movie, Commodus dies not like he does.
Not in the bath. Not in the bath with the wrestler. Exactly.
I'd like to see what they're. How can I say this? I know that they've sort of got the backstory as such, but I'd like to see if they actually mention anything of. I just think Didius Julianus and what's happened in between Commodus and Septimius Severus is a story that actually is worth looking at for a movie in terms of it's like a
but it's not related to Gladiators.
Missed, haven't it? Yeah, but at the same time, you said before the corruption appeals to people, and what's better than somebody going and outbidding somebody else to be
Yeah,
emperor?
I mean, the one thing that we can probably all agree on, that corruption was a feature of the Roman Empire that's historically somewhat accurate. I saw there's a large naval siege scene, which was interesting because apparently what this is supposed to be, it starts with a invasion of Numidia, which we all know was still not under Roman's heel in, well, whenever this is, AD 200, except it had been for centuries. And I thought actually, because Mark mentioned, the whole everything that happens after the death of Commodus and then the eventual rise of Septimius Severus. There is, I mean, we don't hear about hardly any naval operations, let alone of any at scale. Pretty much after Actium, and then when Septimius Severus goes and campaigns against Pescennius Niger, there's descriptions that he collects all the triremes that are in Italy and he builds a whole big fleet and they go and besiege Byzantium while he goes and he's bypasses the city, campaigns against Niger, and when they come back, the siege is still ongoing. So I thought maybe that's where they had this came from, but apparently we're on the other side of the Mediterranean.
It's an interesting one if they're in Africa, when you'd sort of think at the same time there's a great story which they sort of seem to be missing in terms of the rise of the African nobility in Rome's ruling classes at this time, exemplified by Septimius Severus and his two sons, which I think that a lot of people have already commented they do not look anything like African and Syrian heritage as they appear in the film. So therefore, we can seemingly safely assume that they've sort of missed that storyline, and yet they've gone to Africa for a battle scene. On the other hand, I mean, Septimius Severus does campaign in Africa very briefly against some of the tribes to the south, but there's no naval warfare there.
The best description of that siege that you get is actually later from the sieges against Nisibis in the 350s, in 350. So that's where the whole catapults on ships besieging a city that's been, the surrounds of the city have been flooded. That seems to be that's what struck me. But that's, again, wrong century, but that doesn't seem to be a barrier. It's very peculiar. I think there was one scene that looked like it was set on Hadrian's Wall, with the crowd walking around an entry arch, but like swarming around it. I'm not sure. Hard to know. We basically may have bits and pieces from all over the Roman Empire.
Oh, and all over the movie. I mean, that's the problem with trying to comment on a trailer. Clearly, we're getting all kinds of stuff and flashbacks and.
But what was interesting, as a piece itself, I'm as a commentator on the media, because I'm kind of involved in it somewhat. But the interesting thing was that I think 34 million people actually watched the trailers, the official trailer on YouTube, and it was reported I think 150,000 people actually did a dislike of the trailer, which is apparently very untypical. And apparently the thing that people really disliked was not any of the things that we've talked about. It was the music.
But apparently somebody said that I can't remember this, but in the original Gladiator, apparently the first trailer that was released for that actually had some music that didn't go down well, and they changed it after the first trailer. I'm going on just talk here online.
You're right, and in fact, that was then done by Hans Zimmer, which of course is a very famous soundtrack now, and they've even had an orchestra play the soundtrack in the Colosseum in recent years. But actually, Hans Zimmer is not writing the soundtrack for this movie. Another guy writing in a sort of similar style is doing it, so it's not going to be what we heard in the trailer. But I just thought it was actually people feel that possessive about this whole franchise that if you get the wrong sound to it, they get very upset.
But it's also peculiar because I watched Napoleon for the second time. And my wife watched it, and she was appalled at the music. And I'm like, oh, I didn't notice the music. But then when I went back, and I'm like, oh yeah, that the musical choices in Napoleon are awful. It's the most stereotypical. What's a classical piece of music I could put in here? So it's like, oh, this is appalling musical
Well, it is
choices.
the classical music period.
Exactly, but do they use the classical music from that period? No. So you're like, oh, what?
No Beethoven.
you had the perfect piece of music to use. Why didn't you use it? Oh, okay. So I think
it goes back to your earlier point about licensing, maybe, and stuff like that.
yeah, but also about that. I know entertainment, and we saw with Ridley Scott's reaction to the historical criticisms of Napoleon. You know, the famous "Were you there?" comment, that he is not interested in history. He is not interested in making a historically accurate epic. And if you bring up accuracy as a criteria for him, he will block you and poo-poo you, because this is entertainment on film. This is not history. And I think one of the errors, as we saw with the first Gladiator, if you get your history from film, you're getting it in the wrong place. And so, you know, the number of people that we got coming to Roman history in 2000 because of Gladiator, who were turned off history because it wasn't like they saw in the film. And I think the problem is, I don't see Gladiator 2 bringing as many people as Gladiator did. It's not the zeitgeist. It's a sequel. It's been too long in coming, all sorts of things. But I don't think it'll have the same effect. But I think the generation now is even worse for getting their history from the wrong places. So there are going to be people who talk about riding rhinoceroses and all of the things in the Naumachia, and all of that is going to be, this is how it happened. And we're going to spend more time unpacking why it's not how it happened. And all of those political machinations that we've just said are being avoided by the film. It's like, well, actually, this happened before that. This happened a different time. This happened somewhere else. Is more of a problem for us than a benefit.
So what's interesting then is that I was going to reply to your point and say it's really about making money, right? It is a Hollywood product and it's about making money. So to give you the facts, the budget for Gladiator, the first one, was $103 million. That's a lot of money. And that's, of course, in $2,000, not present dollars. It's worth even more in money. It grossed at the box office. That's just the box office, $465.4 million. So that's a 4.5 times return on your money, which is phenomenal. Now, the budget for the new one is about $250 million. They've got to be cracking on and getting a lot of box office at a time when people aren't going to the movie theaters. And it's interesting. I don't know what the actual number of DVD, because they used to sell DVDs, you remember, back in the early 2000s. Now it's all streaming. And I, you know, even though I can actually watch, to zig around, Napoleon on Apple TV, because I have the subscription, I haven't actually watched it because I just decided I haven't got 4 hours of my day to go look at it. But it's going to have to really, really develop some really serious box office to match that return. What I'm hearing is it's not going to do that, which will disappoint the movie makers, who will then be turned off making more, which is not good news. Because I think what we would like is a successful number of franchises in order to keep coming up with these Roman Greek period movies.
Well, I think the most frustrating thing for that is not that we need to remake Spartacus or remake Gladiator. It's that there are so many great stories in Greek, Roman, all history that don't need to be messed with. You do not need to invent things. The story is right there, and it's a peculiar sort of trend of Hollywood to do the lazy choice of making remakes rather than making something new and interesting. And I think it is partially that idea that, oh, but I need to educate my audience first. I want to give them what they expect to see. And therefore, so it'll be the Colosseum. It will be Romans like we understand Romans to be. It'll be this exciting flaming arrows when flaming arrows shouldn't be there, and it'll be siege warfare, because siege warfare by itself apparently isn't exciting enough. You know, you've got to put it on ships with flames. So that whole sort of thing, and you know, again, we've got the gladiatrix, who's looks like she's wearing the same costume as the gladiatrix from Gladiator 1, the bronze corselet, and she's an archer. Well, yeah, but that's one of the weird. Yes. Oh, does she? Spoiler. Oh, sorry. But all I saw was her floating in the water.
One. I
thought, oh yes, in the first one, not the second one. The second one, you see her floating in the water in the bronze corselet, and you're like, hang on, with an arrow.
Doesn't rust. Jeez.
No, just the weight. How is she floating in a bronze? Okay, so there's all sorts of little things, but again, I think one of the problems with trailers though is you can get into the nitty gritty in a way that when you watch the entire movie, you wouldn't, because there's probably so much more you could talk about.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think that the problem is the format, right? Is that the movie that we've now got as a staple is what, 90 minutes long, right? So you've got to be able to collapse a story. It's like the old five-act play, right? You've got to have this sort of this predictable arch that holds the whole thing of the story together. And I guess the reason why these people are taking the easy route of doing remakes is it's like the superhero movie, and Jasper hinted at this earlier, is that you can have a very clear distinction between the good guy and the bad guy, and you can make up this the story.
They're wearing black armor. That's how we know they're the bad guy.
Oh, absolutely. But what it means is when you bring in these other stories, yes, there's a backstory that needs to be learned. I think we can trust the audience to pick that up pretty quickly, and that's why you have that stuff at the words at the beginning of the movie. But I think what's been very interesting in the years since, we've had Domina, which is also somewhat of a bad thing, but they actually put that into two series, right? And they had something like 10 hours in which to tell the story of Augustus Rising and Marcus Agrippa and Tiberius and all those sorts of things. We also had you talked earlier about the Spartacus franchise. I mean, that's now like into the fourth one if this House of Usher comes about. So it turns out that maybe the movie industry is struggling with the format of 90 minutes. But streaming services, the AMCs, the Stars, these kinds of ones, Peacock now with this, Those About to Die, which they were hoping, if you read the publicity, they were hoping this is going to be kind of Game of Thrones set in the Roman period. So it would garner this excitement and loyalty, and then they could obviously, because of its time period, they could go on past the Flavians into who knows where. But it's difficult to make all of this work.
But again, you just have to watch the first episode of Those Who Are About to Die, and you immediately pick up that it's the typical trope of they've got the great story, and as Murray said, they don't have to muck with it, but they have. And again, it's all lots of running around, shouting, and not much in terms of the content that we might like be seeing in terms of actually exploring the stories that are behind each of these individuals, like the Vespasians, like the Titus. They're not being fleshed out. It's all show and games as such.
Yeah, and I think that's the other thing is hooking it onto Gladiators. It's like there are multiple Games of Thrones, multiple series. The Ptolemies would be the most amazing Game of Thrones. The Roman emperors obviously are an amazing Game of Thrones by themselves. You don't need to put gladiators in there because gladiators have very little to do with the assassinations and the machinations behind the throne changing at Rome. And we talk about the year of the four emperors.
If I use one example, just to flesh that out, what I'd said, in that first episode, not trying to throw spoilers around here, but the idea that there is a crisis in terms of grain supply, and that is solved in the first episode by a announcement there on the spot that actually today we're going to have a chariot race, and an hour later they've got a crowd in the Circus Maximus and there's a chariot race going on, and it's
sorted.
It's sorted, yeah. But
in a modern text message / Facebook, let's all go and have a march kind of way.
Exactly, yeah. It was pretty much like that. But yeah, I think leaves a lot to be desired, and too much screen's green. I think there's, as you said, there's lots of scope in all of these stories that we talk about. If Hollywood would be a little bit more brave with their decisions.
But as I say, it is a business, and these
we're not making decisions about very large amounts of money.
Yeah, but the other thing is also you've got to see it against the background that the movie theater companies, the movie companies, and then the distributors, they're in equal trouble. In fact, one of them I think is being closed down in the UK. So the distribution network is under stress. The the business is under stress because the media has changed. We're not going to the movie theaters. Then you've got the competing streaming services, and nobody's making any money out of it, which means people like Paramount Pictures, for example, is in a tricky situation. It's got these big franchises like Star Trek and so on. It's kind of running out of money and looking for a buyer. So it seems to be that the model is bust, and they probably are looking for a couple of big blockbusters to top up and inject some cash into this sort of thing. And they probably looked at Gladiator. Hey, it was 4.5 times the return on the investment made. If we could turn 250 million, 4.5 times. Look how much money that'll bring in at a much needed point in time. But if the audience is not there or is bored with it, It's fascinating to me. So, for example, I just finished watching on Apple TV the last thing he told me, which is a sort of crime thriller set between Sausalito and here in Austin, Texas. They did a lot of filming in Austin, and apparently, in the first 10 days of it being available, it was the most popular thing that people watched on Apple TV. It's a low budget. It's a kind of a family and a missing guy. I mean, there were no special effects. So what it tells you is the audience maybe isn't there for this type of product, which, as I say, is a shame because I think, like Murray said, there are so many great stories, but the movie theaters will turn their backs if these three things are not successful. We'll have a dearth of these things for 10 years.
But then I think the weird thing about that is that this has been happening for a long time, and there's several videos out there of people talking about the investors in movies now wanting to get a 25% return on their investment. So if they invest 100 million, they want 125 million back, and that's driving budgets up. No one wants to invest 4 million and get 500,000 back. No one wants that. They want huge amounts of money. So the problem, I think, is that when a movie like Avatar, which also had very negative responses to the second Avatar film, comes out and still makes $1 billion at the box office, I think people want that model. That's what they're looking for, is that, okay, yes, there's negativity towards the trailer. They're all still going to come to it. They're all still going to come to the theater and watch it. You robbed Gladiator of 40 minutes of its runtime, Lindsay, at 2 hours 35. So clearly, time flew when we were having fun, because it was a bit like, I think that's one of the other things with a lot of these modern films is that the runtimes on them have gotten excessive. And I think it is that idea that in a miniseries, you have 10 hours to tell that story. Take the time to tell the story. And in a film, you don't have that time. But what film has started to do is go, oh, well, I want more time to tell the story that I need to tell. And so, 4-hour films, the Flowers of the Killer Moon and things like that. So it'll be interesting to see, and Napoleon. So it'll be interesting to see how long this is.
We're drifting a bit from what we usually discuss, but we do have a few historical questions. And assuming that I was trying to get at when is this movie actually supposed to be set? And we're apparently seeing Caracalla and Geta. And Don Antonius, one of our patrons, lovely patrons, asked, what was the strategic situation for Rome at the particular moment in time after Septimius Severus' death? And what were Geta and Caracalla planning? And where did Caracalla fail and succeed on the battlefield? Just a small question.
Well, you only got around about 1 year if you want to see Caracalla and Geta together, and especially in Rome, because you've got end of 211 into 212 AD, and that is about that in terms of those two in action. In terms of the sources also describe them as being at loggerheads even before they get back to Rome, and in Rome them being rarely in the same room as each other, in terms of just not being able to stand each other. They end up developing two factions that are rivaling each other for authority in Rome. And it's only when, of course, there's supposedly going to be a getting together and a reconciliation that one story has it that you've got the coming together of the two brothers, and Geta, of course, getting stabbed in his mother's arms, and of course Caracalla then spreading the news that it's actually Geta who's contrived some sort of assassination plot, which he has luckily escaped from, and which he goes with this story to the Praetorians, etc., and seeks the if you like, the ancient equivalent of the media attention to make sure that his story is out there first.
It's important to get the Praetorians on side.
Yeah, at no point do you get those two brothers really cooperating with each other. In fact, Septimius Severus is said to have, in his last words, given advice to the brothers to, that unity is key, that you must keep the outside of the family, etc. And there's even one story of him presenting analogies to the brothers to show that unity is key to them. But of course, even then, when you're looking at their time at the end of Septimius's life in Britannia, Geta is not involved in the military aspect there. Caracalla is out and about on the campaigning. The two of them are separate. in the years running up to Septimius Severus dying and afterward, or in the immediate aftermath.
Septimius Severus dies in Britannia. That campaign has been concluded. I mean, just going back to the strategic situation. When does Caracalla departs east in what's it? And he raises his phalanx, apparently. Was it 15?
Sometime around there. I mean, the interesting thing about Caracalla is in the sources, they're not willing to give him credit for anything that he may have achieved. So the Continuo Antoniniata is under him, the making of all Romans citizens in 212, which is in the sources turned into a tax grab that, well, more Roman citizens mean I can tax more people.
It's not in the sources. That's in an inscription. The sources actually, if you had Cassius.
Cassius writes about it twice. And when he writes about it earlier, it's vague. But when he writes it about the second time, he turns it into a more selfish move. But the interesting thing is that the arguments are that the split in Britain into two provinces also occurs under Caracalla, not Septimius Severus, because there's the distribution of the legions doesn't work. But again, there's sort of like, well, can't give him credit for it, can't give him credit for it. The thing he did, can't give him credit for it. So it seems that there is actually positive maneuvers occurring under Caracalla to split provinces and therefore divide their garrisons and stop rebellions occurring from commanders. But a lot of the source material doesn't want to credit him with it because he makes a far better villain and he's the bad emperor of a good father, just like Commodus was the bad emperor of a good father in Marcus Aurelius. So that kind of trope and stock character really is something that Caracalla is sort of handed until he dies.
If you want to read something into that in terms of go and have a look at the Scriptoria Augusta, and of course at the end of the bit on Septimius Severus, you sort of think, okay, Septimius Severus is dead. That's the end of the life on Septimius Severus. But then there's a wonderful little excerpt after that then starts into that exact idea of, well, no great man is followed by a legitimate son who lives up to his name, and we can show you all the great examples of this. And even the adoptees don't always work out. So actually, it's a lovely little, approach.
I don't know if we know very many examples of battles that Caracalla himself fought with his new army, do we?
Not the new one. I mean, he fought under his father and was apparently quite brutal in the second campaign in Scotland.
But then when he goes east,
he gets credit on his coins and whatnot as victor, but how much of
this is following his father's advice to take care of the army.
Yeah.
So,
but at the same time, most of the rest of his life is away from Rome, so therefore it's going to be very anti-Caracalla when you look at the sources are senatorial based.
I mean, the images of the Senate in the trailer were very stereotypical first century AD pictures, and not many of them. Weirdly, you could have CGI'd all the senators but they don't. There's 50 of them, not 300 or 600. So.
It'd be interesting as well in terms of the first film for Gladiator. They played up the whole idea of bringing back the Republic as a great theme. And I think there's been some talk online of, is Ridley Scott going to rehash this idea? If so, it'd be totally out of place, of course. But again, that would be interesting to see.
You know what it does for me, that hearing all this, it takes me back to one of my favorite epics is the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. I mean, that was, I think, how you do an epic. And of course, there was a gladiator fight in that, which was finally in the square, right at the end with Christopher Plummer, and I forgot the other guy's name, but
Stephen Boyd.
Stephen Boyd, there you go. And that just seemed like great entertainment, a good story. I mean, stars galore. And they spent a phenomenal amount of money building that stage set, and because they built it, it looked really great as opposed to CGI. I'm probably going to go back and watch that this weekend now.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting cycle that Ridley Scott's stuck in with the Gladiator, because it's supposedly Lucius grown up from the first film, and there's been some stories. Why didn't you ask the actual original child actor who's grown up since the first film? But that remake rehash, but there's several elements, very obviously, even in the trailer, where this is the same story. It's not an evolution of narrative. We're stuck in a loop to retell the same story. So I wouldn't be surprised if the revival, there are several comments by Denzel Washington about, Rome must fall. So I wouldn't be surprised if there is the idea of restoring the Republic. Whether we have a Senator Gracchus, which is the weirdest name for a senator in the 2nd century AD in the history of senators, but whether we have that, whether we have a Senator Sejanus, you're like, Sejanus, really? You chose that name? Why that name? But those sorts of things. But those are kind of in-jokes. You actually need to know some Roman history to understand why Senator Gracchus in the first film is such a strange choice for a senator.
But that's why Macrinus makes you curious.
Yeah.
It's a unique one, though. I mean, it stands out amongst a bunch of names that have no basis in history and whatnot. Why have they picked that one? I mean, why do they see him as a important character? Maybe, to end on, maybe say, oh, this is where it's going. I think it's a trick missed in terms of there is such, going back to that whole, the background story of of Septimius Severus and his whole family in terms of that multicultural Rome is changing. And yes, they are sort of sticking with the idea of traditional Rome, what people think of as Rome, which is actually, of course, back in the 1st century BC, really more than actually thinking about 2nd century, 3rd century Rome, which is changing in terms of its dynamics, in terms of where the political force is coming from. What do the provinces do? Why do you have to focus on Rome as such? There's so much to explore there. And in the Septimius's family, I mean, it's a microcosm of the Roman world at that stage. And yet they don't seem to be, from what we can see, they don't seem to be playing that up. Somebody like Julia Domna, bring her in and making her she doesn't seem to be there. Okay, yeah, that's one step further. Yeah, there's some great characters.
But I think it's also strange to find those nuggets of historical truth, or at least accuracy, in what seems to be a blancmange of inaccuracy, but set in a visually recognizable Rome, which never existed. But yes, that existed, but hundreds of years apart. And it's funny, like I did go down a bit of a rabbit hole, for instance, when we watched the Hunger Games, and the names of characters, Plutarch, Sejanus, Cinna, you're like, oh, what's the no, there is no relevance. It's just a name. There is no way you can correlate why you've got an ancient name in that context. So whether there was just like here's a list of the names available, some of which are utterly inaccurate and others which are coincidentally accurate, and him. And we're like trying to puzzle it out, whereas it's probably a far more straightforward, it was just a name that appealed.
So this is where I can make the point that before we came on, I made the point that we criticized modern screenplay writers for inventing these stories, but that's what Romans and Greeks did too, isn't it? In their myths and legends, they might have had a nugget of a story which was a hand-me-down or a family tale or whatever, and then they invented characters. And then there would be poets and there'd be other writers who would actually take a different version, or they'd actually had a whole new theme or subplot. And in fact, that's why you end up with different versions of sometimes the same mythologies and so forth.
So are you now foreshadowing in 2,000 years, somehow a digital copy of Gladiator and Gladiator II has survived as the only sources for actual ancient Roman history, and historians?
We are already seeing AI versions of what the ancient world looked like. You know where to find them. But I just find it very, very interesting from the point of view that that we study, as far as we're able to, factual history, knowing full well that the sources that we use invented stuff or conflated things or gave interpretations and spins on different things. And our challenge is always to tease out what is the fiction, as it were, or the gloss or the spin from what actually happened. And this is why, interesting enough, we're talking about Caracalla Gaeta. Well, of course, the coins actually have Caracalla as being victor because he was in charge. They wouldn't have anything else on them, would they? Because there wasn't an independent narrative to that extent.
I think it's also interesting, though, that like with mythology, we are not in the same mindset of the variations to Greek myths amongst, whether it be Ovid or Virgil or even the Greek authors earlier. That's part of the way that Greek religion works. Myths have variation. We're not, what's the truth? There's not that obsession that we have as historians and as modern viewers, what happened. And so I think there's that interesting variation there. And the problem you have is that you have viewers of a movie today saying this is what happened. And all of those choices that went into the making of the movie, the writing of the script, the having to use visual cues that the audience will recognize, makes them go, this is what happened. And so you then have to, deconstruct that and say, actually, no, that's not what happened. That's what the script writer, what the filmmaker said happened. But as when we tease out things, we're like, one source says this, another source says this seems reasonable, this seems unreasonable. And you then conflate them together and say, this is, I think, the narrative, but always with caveats and I thinks and possiblies and probablys and, in my opinions. And a film can't do that. Because it would be a very dull film if you're giving, and yet at the same time, I think, Rashomon obviously is one of the greatest films ever made. And relatively recently, we had The Last Duel, where you had 3 historical narratives of the same event. And like Rashomon, didn't give us which one's the right one, didn't tell us this is the truth. And so it can be done in film. And I wonder whether you could have easily, not in this particular case, but you could easily have had here's the Gettin narrative, here's the Caracalla narrative, here's the probably what actually happened narrative. All 3 of them varying the truth. But that's a far more complex art film than what Ridley Scott has made in his blockbuster.
On that note, I think we'd all agree that we would do a far better job if somebody only gave us $200 million.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much, all. I hope we didn't bore you with our discussions and theorizing. But think of what we could do with a full movie after just 3 more minutes of this trailer. Thank you all. See you soon. Bye.